Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Get Jashed. Today I have with me Becca Newbold. Becca is a certified coach and mindset and mental health expert and is about to study and start her master's in adolescent and developmental psychology. So I'm so excited to have Becca on here today to talk about what we are talking about. And I'm very, very grateful to have you joining me as well. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. This is so exciting.
It is. So when we were connecting prior to recording and everything, you were sharing about how your niche is in young activists. So I really just want to dive in and start right there is what does that mean? Like what does what's the definition around like what young activists are and activists themselves? So yeah, what got you into that and what is that, just for the clarity of it?
Yeah, so a little bit of a backstory about how I even got into working with activists. I totally did not have a niche at all for a while. And I was just kind of floating until I had my first paid client, and she's running for Congress in 2024
Wow.
in the United States, for those of y'all who are not here.
Yeah.
And it occurred to me that the people who I really want to work with are people who have this desire for change, the people who genuinely want the world to be a better place. And as I kind of settled into a niche, I started finding that working with people who wanted that change wasn't necessarily enough. It was those people who were willing to do the work to create change, not just people who wanted it, right? Because I feel like a lot of people want change, but not everyone has the bravery or the dedication to actually act on that change. And just kind of to clarify on activism, I do want to make it very certain that whenever we say activism, these aren't, I feel like it's kind of become a buzzword, right? Like everyone calls themselves an activist these days.
Yeah.
Yeah. And everyone has settled into this term, just like, oh, I'm an activist. I'm an activist. Well, realistically, unless you are acting, you are not an activist. So unless you are actually doing something about these changes that you're wanting to create, you can't call yourself an activist, because act is literally in the word. Without
Mm.
acting, you're just an ivist. Like you're not really
Yeah, you're
anything
just kind of
specific.
like talking about it, but not actually, yeah, following through or trying to follow through on anything.
Exactly. A lot of doom scrollers like to call themselves activist.
Mm.
And doom scrolling is whenever you're just going through Facebook, just reading all of the terrible posts and sharing them.
Oh,
So you're just reading all of this awful stuff, and then you're sharing this negative energy with the world also. So not only are you just sitting here absorbing negative energy, you're then going as far as to share it with everyone who follows you
mm.
without adding any context. And it is different if you add your own context and you add an action step. Yes, information is important to share. Um, but if you're not adding your own take on it and you're not adding any sort of action step, you can't call yourself an activist.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and I think that is a very specific difference, where whenever I say activist, I'm not just talking about people who, yeah, like want the change or are doom scrolling through Facebook, but people who are actually willing to put in the effort towards it too.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important definition as well. Like, especially, I mean, activists have been around forever and ever, right? Like, it's not a new concept, like, but I think in the current political climate, especially of the last year, like
Hmm.
at least I know that it definitely extends more, but like the last year, I feel like it's been super heightened and super like it is there, and it is like it is very relevant everywhere, but especially in countries like America, right, where it
Yeah,
is this this very present almost like a fact of life now. Like it's just a very
it
present
is.
part of life. Yeah, and I think it's really important to look at those definitions and really consider it for yourself as well. Do you feel like everyone should be an activist, or like what's your stance there? As like, is there a should around it, or is it just, is it by choice and just learning the definition for yourself?
Yeah, so I don't think everyone is meant to be an activist. If you hear random noises, that's just my rat climbing on things, by the
That's
way. But I don't think that everyone is supposed to be an activist. And the reason I say that is that if you put this necessity on it, this like everybody should, then it's going to become a responsibility instead of a right. Like you have, you're not responsible for being an activist, but you have the right to be an activist. And everyone in that way has the ability to. What I would say though is that whenever you speak about activists, I think that if you say that everyone should be an activist, if everyone gets to be an activist, I think it's really important that everyone picks something that they actually care about. You know, you could, a lot of activists too, or a lot of people who call themselves activists are spread so thin because they kind of take on every single issue in the world, and then we get nowhere. And so whenever you very specifically pick an issue that you care about, you know, there are racial justice activists, there are environmental activists. If anything, I consider myself environmental activism, but I kind of, you know, I work with other activists, so I end up in a little bit more of everything, but that's kind of different. But yeah, so short answer, no, I don't think everyone should, but I think everyone has the right to, and if you find a cause that you're passionate enough about, then you should but in that case, you have the ability to choose to act on it and make that cause important to you.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good point, as well, as because like there can be a lot of shaming around if you are like, if you're talking about one cause, there you always see, and by you I mean like the royal you or whoever is listening, right? But like you always see people comment and be like, well, what about this cause over here and this cause over here? And there are so many that are important, and there are like, you know, and it's a hard distinction, and I watch it by observing the world, like people like really well-intending people who are doing really good work, activism work in one area, getting slammed because like, so maybe they're doing activism work in racial justice, right, and equality and reparations in that area, but they might be getting slammed because they're not talking just as much about environmental issues, which are also important, you know, like, or vice versa, or any of the other causes that exist. And it's really tough to watch because it feels like it's kind of shitting on people who are actually showing up and trying to make positive change. And like, how reasonable is it to be across everything, even though you do, like, if you do care about these things, how reasonable is it to be across everything, or is it not at all?
Yeah, so a really common one that around what you were talking about, one of the most common ones that I've seen is people who are an activist in like LGBTQIA plus and gender equality, those two getting slammed for not talking about racial equality.
Yeah.
And I don't know what it is about those that get slammed a lot, and vice versa. Those three are so like tightly connected. Yeah. And I think that it is definitely reasonable to educate your audience. So if you have a platform and there's another cause that's important, I think it's reasonable to send information. Hey, this is a cause. This is really important. Here's something that you can read more about it yourself. But if you are spending the same amount of energy on all of these causes, even if it's more than one, right? Even if it's more than one, you're going to get burnt out. And that's just like a guarantee, unless you're spending zero effort on all of them, in which case it's different. But if you're expending the same amount of effort across all platforms, realistically speaking, it's like if you have 100 grains of rice and you have 10 bowls, you could totally put 10 grains of rice in each bowl, and by the end of it, no one's going to be full. Or you can put 100 grains of rice in one bowl, and at least that person's going to be fed. And I'm not talking about world hunger, guys. This is like not at all relating to that. Just the metaphor. The analogy, When you spread it too thin, none of it gets impacted at all. But whenever you focus on an issue, that issue can get impacted, which will radiate out, and through the ripple effect will impact all these other issues. You just have to have faith in that.
Yeah, and I like what you said about also, like, you can acknowledge, and you're right, those three areas are very tightly interwoven as far as like the sometimes the blame of, you know, like, you're not speaking about this enough. But I do like what you said, like, you know, if you're just like, I just need to focus on this one thing, and here are some of resources, like, you know, you can read more about it here, or this person, this platform is sharing a lot more about this other thing that's sort of connected but still different. You can go follow them for that. I think highlighting those other places or platforms is important, because it's part of the showing up and the acknowledgement, but it's also taking care of you, because we would stress ourselves out if we were trying to feel like, you know, the 10 bowls with 100 grains of rice each, when we only have 100 grains of rice total, right?
Exactly.
Like, it would just totally empty us. And as human beings, I feel like it's, if we stand for causes, it's almost our duty to still take care of ourselves so we can show up for that as best we can.
Yeah, and a lot of that's where a lot of that the balance comes in, right? Where you talk about being an activist and being someone who is mindful and someone who is doing inner work. So I heard something really cool. Everyone knows this phrase where it's like you have to fill your cup before you can give it to someone else. I want to eradicate that, and don't fill your cup and then give to someone else. Overflow your cup and give from the overflow.
Yes.
So whenever you are an activist, and this is really hard because the whole point of people who end up being activists is that they care so deeply about other people or causes in the world, right? I'm an environmental activist that ends up doing a lot more animals than people, but it's this idea that you care so deeply and that it turns into this selflessness. But selflessness ends up being selfishness when you are so selfless that you have nothing left to give.
Yeah.
Because at that point, you can't make that impact. You just can't. And so whenever you talk about finding this balance, it's just so important to be constantly giving to yourself. And I like to say that as much as you give to other people, give to yourself twice as much. So if you spend 4 hours at a protest, then that means that you deserve an 8-hour day of complete self-care.
Yeah.
And by doing that, you're creating this overflow so that whenever you do give, you're giving with impact, you're giving with energy, you're giving with everything that you have, instead of giving from this empty cup that's not really able to impact. And it hurts to say that once you are empty, you can't make an impact, but that's the truth of the matter. Once you're burnt out and you can't leave the house because you're so burnt out, who are you helping?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, exactly. What comes to mind is like those causes that feel like they are very almost life and death, or very in survival mode as well. So like, I feel like in a way, there's probably a privilege of being able to take that time out for you and still feel, you know, like you're safe and are able to do that, and recognizing that sometimes people in those activism roles don't feel that safety, or they don't feel that space, and it makes it even tougher as well. Like, it then just, you know, like there's a lot on the shoulders of people who are in those positions as well, like in any position. It's funny because I was just listening to one of the episodes on Brene Brown's podcast just yesterday, and she talks about the difference between when it comes to social justice, how shaming isn't an effective social justice tool, and how like there is a difference between being held accountable and feeling shame. You know, like if someone were to say to me like, hey, that thing you said was racist, it was not anti-racist, it was racist, like I would feel shame for that, but I would also then take care of like that shame myself. I wouldn't put it on it, like, well, I'd aim not to put it on anyone else, and, you know, hold myself accountable in that way. So that's a different kind of shame than actually shaming people to make change, because that doesn't actually like, that doesn't give them the tools or the will or the desire to actually change, and how they've linked like the correlation between shame and like aggression and oppression and violence and all of those things. So it kind of like begets more of it, which I think is really important to bring in that idea, because it really lands for me, because you kind of, especially in today's climate, again, acknowledging it's not a new thing, but like when it's very, very visible right now in all these different areas, because everything feels like it's at boiling point anyway. how there is a lot of shame on either you're not you're not looking at all of the issues, like, you know, you're not standing for all of the issues in the world, or the shame of like expecting people to do more or be more or how to change and everything like that. And it's that difference and that almost duality between what being a leader and activist means, while also being like mindful in that too, and while also being I would say a kind person in that, that's, you know, like that's recognizing where my words might be shaming for someone, or is it holding them accountable instead?
Yeah.
So it's just really interesting, because I think that plays a role a lot in activism, and it kind of gets forgotten a little bit too, of how the human brain actually works and how that change actually comes about. So where do you see is that all important balance beyond just, you know, like the self-care and the taking care of yourself where you're able to? Where do you see that is that important balance in how we communicate or how we lead as activists, while also leading and communicating as mindful human beings?
Yeah. So I do want to answer that question really fast. I want to touch on this idea that sometimes it's life or death.
Oh,
And I
yes.
do want to acknowledge that, yes, there is so much privilege, even coming from me speaking about this, there's so much privilege coming from this idea that you can take care of yourself after the fact. And it's, as someone who cares deeply, and most people who are watching this are going to feel the same way, it hurts, like physically is painful to think about the fact that there are some people out there who are acting, who literally cannot stop to take care of themselves. And I just want to acknowledge the fact that a lot of what I'm saying does not apply to those situations. This applies more to people who are in a privileged state and able to act from this outside space. So I just want to say that I'm not like an expert on, say, like activists in the middle of a war zone kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that is not really what I'm talking about here. And I do think it's really important as an activist, for anyone who's listening, to keep in mind that what you're doing from afar, again, it's this ripple effect. So when you work hard to change things, through the ripple effect, you will get to change things across the world as well. And you have to have that trust that what you're doing is going to change things. And while it also kind of hurts to say, it's something that I had to come to terms with, just because someone else is hurting does not mean you have to be hurting too. Right? Just because there are people who are going through that, and as difficult as that is to accept, that does not mean that you have to kill yourself trying to change things, because while it does hurt that they are going through that, the best you can do from your situation is to be as effective as you can, and you can't do that without this balance and taking care of yourself and making sure that you're giving from the overflow.
Yeah, well, it comes down to that definition of true empathy. And like, we had awful bushfires like this time last year, or a bit like a bit longer than that now, and it was heartbreaking. Like, it was awful just to watch and hear about it. But I think I really landed on that true definition of empathy then, because it was like, empathy isn't taking on the trauma or the pain of another or of others. It is recognizing it, but it's not taking it on. And in that instance, you know, like, there were a lot of people sharing a lot of information, and it was really tough, and it was important. But I also had to have times where I didn't absorb that information, or I didn't view that information, because it was really impacting me. And there were other people who, like, there were some people who were sort of like, in their businesses, they were like, it feels like nothing else is worth sharing right now, like, you know, let's talk about this. I'm like, yes, and like, I can't donate to help support if I don't continue running my business, for example. So it was that recognition of, I have empathy, but I'm like, I can't take on the trauma and let this debilitate me when it's not my trauma to hold, in a way that stops me from actually being able to help anyway. And then contributing funds, for example, to families who are like misplaced and had lost everything. Like, it was really that recognition of, right, like, what's the actual empathy and what's trying to hold the trauma or take on the trauma for whatever reason.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that a really good kind of out of the box, but it'll put it into an easier way to understand for a lot of people. Example of this, if your best friend breaks her leg or breaks their leg, if they break their leg, you're going to go over and you're going to take care of them. You're going to bring soup or whatever it is, but you're not going to break your leg after them so you can match.
Yes.
You know, you're going to do what you can to take care of them. And if anything, you're going to take more care of yourself so that you can bring them more goodies.
Yeah.
And you're going to make sure
exactly.
that you're able to do that.
Yeah, it's almost using that, like, I guess to use the word privilege again, but in the sense of having two functioning legs, right? Like, you're going to use that ability to help them more rather than like.
Exactly. Yeah. And I like that you mentioned that, if I stop running my business, I can't give. And so you kind of have to think really hard about it and make a difficult decision. Am I actually going to be more helpful if I stop what I'm doing to go sulk about it, or am I going to be more helpful if I, yes, spread the resources for people, but then continue running my life so that I can be more useful? And it's very it's how do I explain this without being like super insulting? If you feel offended, I'm sorry. But it's not in a bad way. But you have the option to sit and sulk, and a lot of times when we sit and we sulk about it and we feel sad about it, it's actually coming from a selfish place.
Yeah.
Because it makes us feel better to feel worse about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It makes
like when you go to a funeral and you don't cry, so you feel bad, but at a much larger scale. And so something bad happens to someone or to something that's far away from us. And to make ourselves feel better, we're like, oh, that person's feeling bad. To make myself feel better, let me cry about it. And I'm not saying that you can't be upset. Of course, it's totally different. But to sit and sulk instead of taking action, that's where there's a little bit of a problem.
Yeah, like when, like for me, in the bushfire example, like we'll use that because it was like it didn't impact me directly. I was very safe, like, you know, everyone I knew was very safe, but it was, if I had like, and I had feelings around it, you know, like, and there was also that normal human processing of like, wow, this is something big and like that's happening and it's awful. But if I had taken myself away from my work in that instance for that reason, you're right, it would have felt selfish because it would have been making it about me rather than going, okay, like, that's not my trauma. I have feels and I have empathy around it. Absolutely. And, you know, maybe I will have a cry because like all the koalas and everything, you know, like there was this whole thing. And I'm still going to show up in the best way that I can in my life because that is the only way that that's the only thing I can do. Like, if I really do want to step into that role of activism, that is the action that I can take. That is what I can do because, you know, otherwise it's making it like, yeah, I'm putting myself in another position that just means that I can't contribute and I can't help and I can't actually step into that activism role in that sense. So
yeah, for sure. And I think that you mentioning, am I making it about me? That even kind of ties back to that question that we skipped earlier. Where when you're finding this balance between being an activist and being a mindful person, a lot of quote activists like to post on Facebook and argue with people on Facebook. And when you do that, I want you to really like ask yourself, and obviously again, not you, but everybody, ask yourself, am I doing this because I actually want to educate this person, or am I doing this because I want to be right? And so you can share things on Facebook, right? Which is an active resource, and you can share something. And you can give your opinion on it and then have a call to action. And that call to action is critical. If you're going to call yourself an activist, there should be a call to action every time you share something. And if you have that call to action, if there's a call to action in the news source, that's kind of different. But if you're just sharing something to share the doomsday, then that's not okay. But having that call to action, it is that person, whoever it is, right? It's Billy Bob's job to read the resource, do the call to action. And if Billy Bob chooses not to and chooses to argue with you, you can either sit and absorb all that negativity by arguing back, and you can try to be right, which is wasting your energy. Or you can just repeat, you know, well, read the resource. This is your thing now, and then step away from that situation.
Yeah.
Because most of the time, I guarantee you that if you actually are honest with yourself, when you're arguing with someone on Facebook, it's not because you want to educate someone, it's because you want to be right and you want them
Yeah.
to be wrong.
Yeah. And I like actually going back to what you did say earlier in relation to that is about like when you're absorbing that negative energy and then you're just sharing more of it.
Yeah.
And with this, as you're completely right, is what's the intention behind it? Like what's the actual real reason? And like we're human, like I'm human. I've definitely wanted to be right many times. Like, like that's a thing, but it's really about just checking in and going, what's the intention? What's the outcome that I want? Is it to share the resource and the call to action and then allow people to make their own choices because they are their own human beings and they get to choose? Like going back to the whole thing about whether everyone is an activist or not, like you get to choose whether you step into this or not. Like from that perspective, like you're giving other people the privilege of their own decisions rather than sitting there telling them they should and then arguing and trying to be right rather than going, okay, well, like, I put this information out there. I've said my piece. Like if this person isn't ready to hear that or have a conversation about it, like why would I spend my energy doing that also? Because it just feeds the negativity instead.
Yeah. And one of my specialties as a coach is energy management, which comes into play a lot with being an activist. And so whenever you are arguing with someone, consider the fact that you are giving this person your energy for free, right? They started like, it's like adding gas to a flame. I don't know what it's called, but it's like adding fuel to a fire. That's the phrase.
That's the one.
So you're adding fuel to the fire. And if you have this person who already disagrees with your cause, right? And then pulling in psychology too. Imagine that they're like a kid. If you tell a little kid what to do, most of the time they're not going to be happy about it, right? But if you ask them what they would rather do and say, okay, well, do you want to wear this outfit or this outfit? They're going to pick an outfit. But if you say put on clothes, they're going to run around naked. Yeah. So it's a lot like that, where when you're speaking to someone who's disagreeing with you, the reason that they're arguing with you to begin with is because there's probably some unhealed trauma from their own childhood, right? And when you add fuel to that fire, you are making them less likely to ever become an activist. You're making them less likely to ever join this cause. But if they say something, let's say a good example, it would be gender equality. I feel more comfortable talking about that one. But if you're talking about gender equality and someone's like, no, women get paid just as much, you can say again, well, the article states this. If you have a resource that disagrees, I'd love to see it.
Yeah.
And instead of saying, no, you're wrong, let me tell you why, that's just going to continue the argument. But if you ask for a resource, 9 times out of 10, they don't have a freaking resource. And then they're going to have to acknowledge that and then make a decision for themselves. But after you do that, you're done. And as soon as this conversation is draining your energy, you can tell them, hey, glad we had this talk. Glad to know your opinions. I respect your opinions, even if we disagree. And I'm done with this conversation. And then literally stop replying.
Yeah.
So often I see people, no, I'm done with this conversation, and then keep replying and arguing. It's ridiculous. Actively stop replying, because literally, what does it matter if this person doesn't agree with you? Yeah. What's it going to change? Absolutely nothing.
Put your energy to somewhere where it's like actually going to have more of that impact. And I think that's what it is, like just going back to even like the burnout, right, of activism. It is around being smarter with it and recognizing like where you're arguing like at a brick wall, or using that basic premise of psychology of, like you said, like if you're going to, give them the information or the 2 options, but rather than be like, you're wrong or do this, like, it's like, hey, you're your own human being, you have your choice, and then being smart with your energy. So that way it doesn't drain you, but you know that you're showing up in the best way possible, and also in like the most psychologically smart way possible, because that way people will get to have their own thought processes around it and then come to their own decisions rather than feeling like they're told to, which feels like very much like a regime, then you go into dangerous territory in that way. So
exactly. Yeah. And I also feel like tying in that mindfulness, it's hypocritical to call yourself a peaceful person and then engage in arguments. And I'm
Yeah.
not saying that if you engage in an argument or if you argue with someone that you're automatically not a peaceful person, but if you are advocating for peace, which I think every single activist in some way is advocating for peace, if you're advocating for peace and then engaging in arguments all the time, you're being a hypocrite. And I'm very blunt. I'm always the one to call people
Yeah.
out. If y'all haven't noticed yet already, that is definitely me. But to advocate for peace and then to engage in arguments, it's just kind of giving yourself a bad rep. And then why would someone listen to you when it does come to something that they could potentially listen for and change about themselves, when psychologically and subconsciously they already know you as someone who doesn't live by what they speak for?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like if there's an incongruence in like the energy there and in the intention there. And I would also say it's also if you say that you're a peaceful person, right, and then you're constantly like, or a loving person, and you just care about everyone and you want everyone to, like feel like whatever it is, but then you're shaming people without checking yourself. Like it's the same thing. It's the arguing, it's the shaming. It's like, well, actually that's not what's helping, and that's what actually causes everyone to end up arguing and fighting anyway, which is then awful for everyone else to witness and experience. So it's
and what really helped me, like being younger, I used to argue with people on Facebook all the time, like ridiculously. And so I am speaking from a very personal place here because that was totally me, right? But what helped me a lot was asking myself, okay, do I want to spend my energy right now on arguing with Uncle so-and-so, right, who's clearly racist and homophobic and is not going to change his mind on that? Like, do I want to spend my energy arguing, or do I want to spend my energy gathering up like-minded people to sign a petition to send off to a congressman?
Yeah.
Like, which one, or your state person, whoever's in charge of you. I don't know where people are listening to this from.
But seems like we'll get it. Yeah, exactly. Like it's like,
so you can either, so that's where what you really want to ask yourself, do you want to spend your energy arguing with someone, and that's not activism, or do you want to be an activist and gather people and actually help make a change? Yeah. And doing that way is also, it's very empowering, right? Because whenever you actually act on things, you're feeling more empowered, which is going to fill your cup back up. But if you're just sitting there doom scrolling and arguing with people and focusing on all these negative aspects of what it is that you're fighting for, you're going to get more drained, and that's how you burn out a lot faster. But part of activism, whenever you are acting and implementing and actually doing things about it, it empowers you and fills you with the energy so that you can do more, because it's showing you that yes, change is possible. But if you're just doom scrolling and arguing, focusing on that negative, internally you're not going to believe that change is possible.
Yeah, it's funny because like I only shared last week, you can do this on your own personal level as well, like if, for example, if COVID feels super hopeless for you and you just feel that sense of hopelessness, like let that move through you. Because this is what happened to me last week. Like I just had this moment where I'm like, man, like there's so many decisions I can't make, or I can't, like there's so many uncertainties, and what can I even do about that? And then I was joking because I went through that, a hopelessness as such, and then I felt the rage come in, which is like up the emotional scale of from hopelessness up to rage. I'm like, great. So I was having these like almost like shower arguments, how like you stand in the shower, you're just like imagining these arguments with like I was having like these shower arguments with our politicians, so like with our prime minister and everything, because I'm like, you're not giving us enough vision of like how to act, like what's the vision of moving out of this rather than just handling it right now. Like give people hope, because people need hope from a mental health perspective. Like this is a collective trauma we're all going through. Like we need to know, even though we don't know the timeline of the vision, we need to know what the freaking vision is and what the plan is. So this was my whole so even for your own mindset, if like bringing it back to you and taking care of you, if you're feeling hopeless, you can feel the rage, because a lot of our decisions, and like you said, activists, like it's because there's so much care about something, there's so much emotion about something. let the rage move through. And then on the other side of that shower, I'm like, oh, like you said, I'm like, oh, I could actually gather those resources and put together a plan. It doesn't have to end up
Yep.
being the plan, right? But actually like contribute something. Just put forward
Yeah.
suggestions, because otherwise, like, like, and
Yeah.
gather the resources and say, this is the impact. This is like a potential way that you could communicate that, because that is within my skill set, is the communication, especially like an
Mhm.
emotional intelligence and leadership, right? So I'm like, oh, I could actually gather those resources, put together like the suggestions on how to communicate, what to do, like, why it's important from a research-based level, and go to my, like, our federal member for that, like our
Yeah.
MP for that, and go here. And that became such like a relief, because A, it gave me something I could do in a world of literal uncertainty.
Mhm.
Like, it actually gave me the action step I could take. It's contributing to a possible solution. It doesn't have to be the solution, but it's contributing.
Mhm.
It's
Yeah.
using my voice for something that's useful, rather
That is
than
so
just like,
important that it does not have to be the solution. It is
yeah,
contributing to a solution. Yes,
yeah,
100%.
it's contributing to the conversation. It's saying, hey, this is important to me. This
Mhm.
is why it's important to me. This is why it should be important to you. Here are some suggestions based on like my skill set or my expertise or the research or all of the above, right? So there's a sense of contributing, and then also like knowing that I've used my voice for something that is impacting me or that I care about, and then being able to go like, okay, that's better than like pissing and moaning and like just complaining about it. And yes, I'll still feel like moments of whatever I feel, but that gives me something to do,
Yeah.
rather than, doom scrolling about COVID and like border closures and all of that stuff on Facebook and in socials, right? Like, or just complaining about it with other people. It's like, oh, actually, well, yeah, it still sucks, but this is what I did about it.
Mhm. Yeah, and to kinda give an even, like, larger example of how much this,
Mm.
like, hope can just change the entire outlook and the entire energy, um, for those of y'all who aren't in America, I'm not sure if I mean, I think everyone was following the freaking inauguration,
Oh
um,
yeah.
last month. Yeah, I think the entire
Yeah.
world was staring at the inauguration. So, on
Uh-huh.
What was it? January 20 something, I don't even remember, and I'm in here. Um, I can't remember the day for some reason, but on the day of the inauguration, you could literally feel the energy in the entire country shift. And the
Mm.
reason was that all of a sudden we were being told about hope, right?
Yes.
Like we instead of being told about how, well, here's what's happening in the economy, here's what's happening in XY, like here's everything that's going wrong. All of a
Yeah.
sudden, we had leadership who was like, okay, here's exactly what we're gonna do about it, and here's our plan, and here's the outcome.
Yes, it's the communication of, this is
Yeah.
the vision, this is what we're doing, this is what we're working towards, this is the
Yeah.
intention.
And of course, that's a very large example, and we're not all the president or the prime minister or the
Mm,
whoever else in each country. But that being said, every single, if you're in any free country, which I think that if you're listening to this, you probably are,
yeah.
every single elected official that you have, or even unelected, all your government officials have public email addresses.
Mm-hmm.
And it is not hard to find them if you literally just look it up. Like I can literally look up like Joe Biden email address and I'd get President Biden's email address. I mean, it's going to be a secretary reading it, but like I
Yeah.
really could. But that being said, when you do this and you look someone up, it can be the shortest email ever. Like, hey, what is your plan for XYZ? Maybe they don't have a plan and they're going to ask you why it's important. You could be the catalyst for change, but you can't possibly do that if you do nothing.
Yeah. And they can't, like, they don't necessarily know what's wrong if you don't tell them. Like, they
Yeah.
could, obviously make educated guesses, but like, they don't actually know what matters to their people, the
Hmm.
people that they serve,
Yeah.
because they serve us, like in any country, like, well, in any free country, like they serve us, like,
Yeah.
that's the whole, that they're governing, they're the ones that are like serving the people. So they don't know what matters to the people unless you
Hmm.
communicate that,
Yeah. And
but
there
be
was a
smart
story
about it.
of, yeah, a really like even like a much smaller example to like give more empowerment. I think there was I don't remember who it was, but someone living in a community, and she noticed that all of the Christmas trees every single year were getting thrown in the dump. And it's so wasteful. And as like an environmental activist myself, that's why I know about all this stuff, right? Because I have so many journals that come in. So this one specifically really like hit me, where she sent a single email to the management of her community, and they organized a tree drop to be sent to turn into mulch instead of going
Wow.
to the garbage. One person, one email. I mean, they went back and forth after that, right? But like, that is how simple it is to start small. And I think that a lot of activism is looking for the grand solution. And so we feel so disempowered because we can't come up with the grand, huge solution. But like, what can you do to start small, to start today? You know, can you email the people in your community to ask for recycling bins? Can you like ask to do a little bit less watering? I'm always thinking of environmental examples.
Yeah.
Thinking about other ones though,
They're
how
great
can you
examples.
yeah, but can you email the dean of your school to talk about having like a racial justice seminar? You know, there's always going to be something smaller. And if thinking of all the big things feels super disempowering, think of what is within your direct reach, like what's in your circle that you can touch directly. Because I totally get how hard it is to think about issues across the world and feel powerless, but you have power when you start small. And it's again that ripple effect that even when you start small, it's going to spread into things like other bigger things.
Yeah, because it has the ripple effect of like other people, like it's the small things that actually build up anyway, rather than the big things, because the big things will seem out of reach for the average person anyway, right? But
Yeah.
it's the small things that, like you said, like that empower people, and it helps people who may not be on board because, you know, like for whatever reason, they may just feel like environmental issues are too big anyway. If you're doing the small things and having that show up in a reachable way in everyday life, then it helps people to kind of come to understand on that almost kind of grassroots level. Not that it's a grassroots movement, but you know, like on that level,
Yeah, for
that
sure.
gets like that momentum, and that gets that, you know, that change happening that then speeds it all up anyway.
Yeah. And I think that's also where a lot of this mindfulness kind of ties in, because we're taught that the only things that are worthy or deserving are the big things. And that is so common. It's common in the United States. I assume it's common otherwhere in the other places in the world, but we're taught that, you know, bigger is better. And the more you do, the more worthy you are and the more change. And so we start reaching for these impossible goals that just make us feel powerless and insecure in our own worth. But when you're able to just kind of stop and accept that, first of all, existing, like you just existing is enough. You just existing makes you worthy. And when you can accept that small, that just you being here is enough, is making you worthy, makes you deserving, you'll find that it's a lot easier to accept that, okay, impacting my direct community is still worthy. Like it's still enough. And it feels a lot easier to stop, not to stop there, but to start there than to start trying to reach for these big impossible goals when you accept that even just by existing, you're already doing enough. So anything above that is you going above and beyond.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such an important conversation, and I love conversations that make it more reachable for people to actually like grab a hold of. So I'm so grateful for you to come on and share that with us as well, and just help us like have more of that conversation, because it just becomes more of an achievable thing the more we talk about it in these ways, and like bring a bit of context into how we can approach that as well. So Becca, thank you so much for coming on. Where can people find you and your work?
Yeah, so there's like a million places to find me. Easiest ones are going to be through my Instagram at Daffodil Daily. Daffodil like the flower, daily is in like every day. So at Daffodil Daily on Instagram. My business is Daffodil Daily LLC. Through that Instagram, you'll be able to find, I have a art Instagram, which every single piece of art that I sell, 15% of those profits go toward environmental groups. So check those out. That's at Daffodil Daily Art on Instagram. And then the other place would be my podcast. It's called Mind Your Mindset. It's on Spotify and a few other platforms, but there's also an Instagram for that, which is going to be easier to find. If you just go to at Mind Your Mindset podcast on Instagram, those are going to be the easiest. If you find me on Instagram, you'll find the link to everything else.
Awesome. Thank you so, so much for such an important conversation and such important context around that duality and that balance between activism and all important mindfulness when we do step into that space also. So I'm so grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was such an honor.